Hi, everyone. Good morning and welcome to the podcast. My name is Andy Shepherd. I am the clinical lead here at ReadyCare. And in today's session, this morning's session, what we're going to be doing is talking about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and, more importantly, how to reverse it if you have been diagnosed with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So first, let's talk about what fatty liver is. So you've probably heard of fatty liver in the sense that if you drink a lot of alcohol, fat can build up in your liver, and that is true. However, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, as the name infers, is fatty liver that can't be explained by overconsumption of alcohol. That's literally the diagnosis. So if they see fat in your liver, and there's various different tests they can do for that, they will do something like a FibroScan or any other scan for fatty liver, or even see the amount of liver in your fat in terms of triglycerides, and diagnose you with a fatty liver. Ask you, do you drink a lot of alcohol? If the answer is definitely not enough to explain that, then that is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So let's look at what the disease is, why it's important, what causes it, what foods you can eat that will reverse it, which is totally counterintuitive, and then just a little kind of a synopsis of what foods to choose and what foods to avoid if you are dealing with fatty liver and you want to reverse it. Guys, if you haven't already, don't forget to like and subscribe, and thanks for joining us. Okay, so let's take a look at what non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is. So first of all, it's the most common liver disease in the Western world by a mile. No, this is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So we know non-alcoholic fatty liver disease appears more in the Western world because it's driven predominantly by sugar, refined carbohydrates, all that sort of stuff, the processed foods. It's the most common liver disease in the world. So that means it's more common than alcoholic fatty liver. So there are more people with horrible complications and, high risk of heart disease and diabetes and stroke and liver cirrhosis, liver transplants from eating sugar than there are people in trouble with their livers because of alcohol. So you think about your liver health and you say, well, you should definitely drink less alcohol. Actually, the real elephant in the room here in terms of prevalence is eating less sugar and processed carbohydrates. So we'll talk about that in a second. It is the second most common reason for liver transplant. That statistic is likely explained, and I'm making assumptions here, but likely explained by the fact that because alcohol is so addictive, if you are an alcoholic, it can still be very difficult to give up alcohol, even if you're faced with potentially needing a liver transplant. Whereas if someone says to you, it's probably your diet, if you eat well and lose a bit of weight, you could reverse it. You might be able to turn it around. So it's the second most common reason for liver transplant after alcoholic fatty liver disease. And the leading indication for transplant in people under the age of 50. And also the leading predisposing factor for primary liver cancer. So it's a really, really serious illness. It's one that kind of goes undiagnosed for a long time. So Professor Roy Taylor in the UK, real groundbreaking guy in the whole kind of fatty liver, type 2 heart disease, low carb keto space, has a very good quote that says, long before the onset of diabetes, so about 10 years, there's a long and silent scream from the liver. So your liver starts to build up with fat for years and years and years, and then all of a sudden that goes on to be the beginnings of type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, weight around the midsection, and so on. Okay, interestingly enough, if you look at your liver enzymes, which are known as LFTs in your doctor's tests, they can be normal in people who have fatty liver. That's interesting to know. And not until you check with something called a kappa-controlled attenuation parameter might you even know that you have fatty liver in the first place. Now, if we look at the prevalence, the kind of global prevalence, this is a study done in Germany. So 40%, 40, almost 1 in 2 of adults in the Western world have fatty liver. 1 in 2. So broadly speaking, if you see someone with, or if you are, weight around the midsection, blood pressure is up a little bit, cholesterol issues, a lot of that stuff, where you store your fat in particular, is indicative of what type of fat is being stored. So if you see that kind of basketball donut-y shape where you get the hardening of fat around the midsection, or you just have any fat around the midsection and it goes there before anyone else, broadly speaking, that's a good sign or a red flag for metabolic dysfunction. Your blood sugar levels are trending high and your body is likely inappropriately storing fat in internal organs, including your liver, your tongue, which is sleep apnea. Liver is fatty liver. You get what's known as ectopic fat storage, which is fat stored in the heart, pancreatic fat storage, and so on. So 40% of adults. Now 60%, because of the connection between where you store your fat and the fat being stored around internal organs, which we call visceral fat storage. Visceral just means around internal organs, around your belly, all around that area, as opposed to your shoulders, your face, your back, your bum, that sort of stuff. That's more hormonal weight when you see it on bum and back and so on. 60% of those who are overweight or obese, OWO, have a fatty liver. So very, very high. Now, again, because of the connection where I was talking about with Roy Taylor saying that before you become diabetic, you end up with a fatty liver, 90% of those with type 2 diabetes, when checked, have a fatty liver as well. And sadly, 30% of children who are overweight or obese also have a fatty liver. Those kids in that particular study were 8 years of age. I have a son who's 8. So, I mean, it saddens me to think that 1 in 3 kids who are overweight have a fatty liver and are likely going to go on to become type 2 diabetic. This is just a paper showing that not only is fatty liver kind of at the root of type 2, a lot of heart disease, adipose tissue being stored around the midsection, it's an independent risk factor for heart disease. So what that means is that if you have nothing else going on and your doctor says, oh, well, you do have a fatty liver, but don't worry about it, could be genetic. It's an independent risk factor. If you don't have type 2 diabetes, if you don't have a lot of weight around the midsection, you don't have high blood pressure, heart disease, no family history, even just having a fatty liver in and of itself is a significant risk for heart disease down the line. So if we look at diet, a diet is by far and away the main driver of fat in your liver. There are a couple of things that can cause fat to build up in your liver. One, which is very well understood, is alcohol. The body doesn't really know how to process alcohol appropriately because it's a toxin, it's a neurotoxin. People will, they'll say all this, 1 glass of wine with your dinner is good for your health. That's absolute, complete and utter nonsense. Alcohol is a known hepatotoxin, which is a liver toxin. It's a known neurotoxin, which means it's bad for your brain, contributes to leaky gut, it dehydrates you, it degrades your sleep quality. Unfortunately, it's great crack and it helps you relax. So there's the balance between the two that we all have to strike. And by the way, I'm not anti drinking alcohol. I do drink alcohol, very much so in moderation, only a little bit. But it's important to know that it is a neurotoxin, and people talking about in the blue zones, when they drank 1 glass of wine a day, they had better heart health and they lived longer. That's correct, but they also had a sense of community, religion, didn't eat processed food, exercise more, and so on and so forth. So that's associational data. Alcohol is definitely bad for you. Okay, so if we look at the other things that can contribute to and do contribute to a fatty liver, we have these main suspects. We have animal fats like eggs, butter, cream, fatty meats. This is the obvious one that you would go, well, surely, and I say obvious in kind of sarcastically, but you might look at this and think, well, surely eggs and fat and cholesterol and all the stuff that ends up in your liver, they're kind of one of the same thing, aren't they? Surely eating more animal fats in particular is going to cause your liver fat to build up. You might be surprised. So we'll have a look at that in a second. Carbs like rice, pasta, bread, potatoes, I mean, it would stand to reason that they would help you because they haven't got fat in them. And then fruits, bananas, grapes, that sort of stuff, tropical fruits. I mean, surely they'd help too because they're quote unquote healthy because they're natural. Let's see. So they've actually looked at this in studies, which is really interesting. Now, if you're not well versed in metabolic health science, and metabolic health science means how foods in particular relate to, type 2 diabetes, weight loss, blood pressure, fatty liver, sleep apnea, and so on. If you don't understand the physiology, it would be a fair assumption to say you have fat in your liver, you should eat less fat, which is kind of like someone saying, you're retaining loads of water, you should drink less water. It's not how the body works. So let's have a look. They actually looked at this in a few studies over the last few years. And the results are, I mean, they're not up for debate anymore. We know which type of a dietary protocol reverses fatty liver, and it's not what you might think. So this particular paper, what they did was, it was a really interesting paper. It was entitled Sources of Fatty Acids Stored in the Liver and Secreted via Lipoproteins in Patients with Non-Alcoholic Fatty Liver Disease, which is basically a way of saying what foods caused your liver to end up building up in fat. So what they did is they used something really clever study. They used something called radioactive tracers. So you can infuse foods with these kind of tracers. They almost look like food colorings. And you can trace them by scanning and seeing where they're going and what they're doing. So they would feed them, say, for example, bread, rice, pasta. real high carb foods that don't have a whole lot of protein and fat in them, and they would see how much of that food ended up being converted to fat in the liver. They would feed them eggs, cream, cheese, butter, fatty meats. Same thing, infused with radioactive tracers. Let's see how much fat ended up in the liver. And the same with fructose, which is the main type of sugar, naturally occurring sugar found in fruit. Which, by the way, there's a great paper, if anyone is interested in this type of research, called Fructose, a Weapon of Mass Destruction for Your Liver. That was the name of the paper. Fructose is horrendous for your liver. So again, you might make the mistake of going, I need to eat a bit healthier, so I'm going to eat bananas and grapes and pineapples. They're arguably the worst foods you can eat for your liver, and liver fat in particular, which also played out in this paper. So what the paper showed was 59% of the fat stored came from, technically we call it lipolysis of adipocytes, which is basically what happens when you gain new fat under the action of insulin. And 26% were driven by, so 59% and 26, so 85% in total of fat that ended up, new fat that ended up in your liver were driven by carbs and fructose. So rice, pasta, bread, and fruit sugar. So fruit sugar actually is 7 times more likely to end up as fat in your liver than actual sugar itself. So bizarrely, from a fatty liver point of view, not for everything else, but from a fatty liver point of view, and this is where nutritional science can get really tricky, you'd actually be better off having the 7 spoons of sugar in a cup of tea than you would be having a banana from a liver fat point of view. And there are interesting studies around that, actually. They show that in kids, if you just get fructose out and put actual sugar in, it's slightly better. That said, with the caveat that sugar is horrendously bad for your health, but fructose can be even worse, particularly if you have what we call insulin resistance or problems with your metabolic health, like type 2 diabetes and fatty liver. So 15% of the fat that ended up in your liver came from eggs, fat, cream, cheese, all that sort of stuff. Only 15% of that converted. So completely counterintuitively, if you're not kind of deep into this metabolic health science, what happens is carbohydrates, when overconsumed, now remember, if you have a fatty liver, it starts to affect the rest of your body. It starts to impair your pancreas' ability to make insulin, which is a hormone that tries to lower your blood sugar levels with. So if you're eating a lot of carbs and sugar, what happens with the carbs and sugar is excess carbohydrate and glucose, when your glucose levels are high, are converted into what we call triglycerides. Triglycerides are fats and shoved into your liver. So over-consuming carbohydrates when you're already struggling to deal with carbs causes a fatty liver. Fruit doesn't even, fruit sugar is just directly into the liver. It's one of the only substances in food that will just go straight into the liver aside from alcohol. Your body says, I don't really know how to deal with this. And if you have large quantities of it, if you have things like bananas and tropical fruits, it converts every single gram of that fructose goes directly into the liver. So arguably the quickest way to give yourself a fatty liver, and we see this in organic foie gras, so the kind of fattied liver, if you're having like a duck liver pate or something like that, they make organic foie gras by feeding overly ripened fruit, which is higher again in fructose, to the ducks. The reason they do that and allow them to eat it is because they'll just continue to eat and eat and eat because it tastes sweet, and they'll keep doing it till they're sick. In the non-organic version of it, which is horrible, but this is just a fact, they'll actually tape and strap a tube with kind of grains and millet and carbohydrates and feed that to the duck so that they can't stop eating it. So they just pump it into them and the liver becomes fat. They are not feeding them olive oil, walnuts, eggs, cheese, butter, cream. They're not feeding them fat. And the same thing, unfortunately, happens in humans. So carbohydrates, and particularly refined carbs like breads, grains, granola bars, frozen pizzas, all those kind of refined beigey and white foods that we have no physiological requirement for, actually, and high fructose fruits are, without question, the main drivers of what we call de novo lipogenesis, new fat storage in the liver, not dietary fat itself, which is why, strange as it may seem, a ketogenic diet or a very low carb, higher fat diet will often reverse fatty liver. So totally counterintuitive, but there you go. Okay, we spoke about this a second ago. So basically with glucose, you have some glucose will go into your muscle in the form of glycogen. That's when people talk about fueling themselves up for a workout or not feeling explosive if they don't have some carbs before doing weight training. The rest will enter into the bloodstream. The pancreas will secrete insulin to lower down your blood sugar levels, and then you'll get some will go into the liver. With fructose, you've got it going directly into the liver. That's it. There is no stopping on that train. It's going directly to the liver, which creates a fatty liver. And actually, that particular paper was the one I was talking about. The diagram from that paper is from fructose as a weapon of mass destruction from a hepatology paper, which is around liver. So you might say, well, surely there will be studies where they put people on high fat diets and they, reverse fatty liver, and there are. So there's a really, really clever paper from, I think it was about 10 years ago. I think that says 2011, but I can't see properly. 10 or 12, 13 years ago, where they got two groups. One were put on a low fat diet, which is a high carb diet. So a low fat diet is by default a high carb diet. The others were put on a low carb diet. They put them on the same amount of calories, same caloric deficit, so that they would lose around the same amount of weight. Both groups lost 5 kgs, which equated to 5% in terms of their weight loss. So you had those things standardized. There was no bias there. So, you could say, well, sure, they lost 10%. Of course, they had more liver fat loss. So it wouldn't have been a fair comparison if the two groups had lost different amounts of weight. So same amount of weight loss in both groups. Really clever study, how they managed to keep the weight loss the same. And then they looked at their intrahepatic triglyceride levels, which is basically a marker for liver fat. And they looked at all the different tests you can do. You can do these kind of, funnily enough, what they do is that they send, now I don't know the exact science behind it. I think it's known as fibroscan. They send kind of sound waves to the liver, and they watch how much of a bounce there is from those sound waves coming back to the unit, the fibroscan unit, which is a way of getting a proxy for how wobbly is your liver. So as your liver becomes fatty, it gets kind of rigid and tough. And if it's not sending the sound waves back, if it's just they can gauge by the way it bounces off them, or otherwise how much fat will be in your liver. So the liver fat reduction on the group who lost 5%, who lost 5 kgs but were low fat, was 28%. On the group who were low carb, which remember is high fat, the liver fat reduction was 55%. It was just 1% under double the liver fat reduction. So this is a study, just to take a step back from it, that shows if you have fatty liver, on average, if you go on a low carb but high fat diet, so again, reducing bread, rice, pasta, potatoes, and tropical fruits, and eating more cream, eggs, butter, cheese, all that sort of stuff, on average, you'll get double the reduction in your liver fat. And we see this all the time in our work with the NHS, all the time. People saying my liver enzymes, which are the more common ones, are ALT, adenine transaminase, and GGT, gamma glutamate transferase, which are proxies for liver function, improved dramatically, often by 50, 67%, 70%. So again, we see anecdotal evidence of this all the time. There's numerous studies that report the same thing. So again, here is a paper, I believe this was Virta Health, and it says it on the bottom right there. So if you look at their liver fat score, low fat versus low carb, you'd see on the right-hand side a 74% reduction, 71% reduction, 74% reduction in liver fat. And Virta Health, by the way, just for clarity there, or for context, are huge advocates of a lower carb, high fat, moderate protein diet, also referred to sometimes as a ketogenic diet at the more extreme end of the scale. So liver fat down 74% on a low carb diet, high fat diet, and your fibrosis, which is kind of scarring of the liver, it's a measure of scarring, down 71%. So huge results there. And again, we see something similar. Okay, so just to wrap it up, just to summarize, if you want to reduce the amount of fat you have in your liver by 50% or more, and also lose weight, improve your heart health, improve your neurological function, your immune system, everything right across the board. Less of the beigey, blandy type foods that our body has zero requirement for. Now, the reason I say zero requirement, when people say, but you need glucose for energy, you do. You need a tiny bit of glucose for energy for your internal organs. You do not need to get them from carbohydrates. Your body has a fantastic way of producing the little bit of glucose it needs for your brain through a process known as gluconeogenesis, which is a demand-driven process whereby your liver produces glucose from excess protein. So you have a little bit more protein, or your body wants to break down a little bit of protein, it converts it to glucose, and you are good to go. And that should be evident by our ancestry or evolution, whereby we had no meaningful amount of carbohydrates for millions of years, a couple of million years, up until the last couple of thousand years. So we would have had to have a default energy source, which we also do in the form of ketones, which is running on fats. So you can, and this is where people conflate these two things, you can use carbohydrates for energy, but you do not require carbohydrates for energy. That's a misnomer. It's a misinterpretation of the literature. So eat less bread, rice, pasta, breakfast cereals, sugary fizzy drinks, starchy vegetables, cakes, pastries, and high sugar fruits. And interestingly, totally counterintuitively, meats, fish, seafood, full fat cheese, eat more. Olive oil, eat more. Real butter, avocado, chia seeds, eggs, green vegetables, above ground vegetables, which are lower in sugar and carbohydrate. Eat more of those, guys. So all is not what it seems when it comes to reversing fatty liver. You do things that are kind of counterintuitive, and in the grand scheme of things, are actually great for your health overall. So listen, I will leave it at that, guys. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me. I appreciate you guys being here, and we'll see you in the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.